In a quiet stone room, tucked away behind the high walls of a chateau in the Loire Valley, a candle breathes softly in the dark. Its flame, gentle and golden, bends with each delicate sigh of wind sneaking past the wooden shutters. The night is still. No voices, no footsteps, just the rhythmic crackling of wax melting into memory. Beside the flame, there is a book. Its cover is worn and softened by time, edges curled from years of being opened, closed, carried, and forgotten. The pages are filled with fine lines, delicate curves, and symbols that seem to dance across the surface. The handwriting of a man who rarely slept, who lived more in thought than in speech. That man was Leonardo da Vinci. But tonight, we do not enter the world of invention, or art, or war machines. Tonight, we do not speak of the Mona Lisa's smile, or the mystery of the Last Supper. Tonight, we sit with Leonardo in this final room, at this final desk, under this flickering flame, not to study his genius, but to feel the quiet behind it. The book before us is not a treatise. It is not a commission for a duke or a king. It is not a plan for a weapon or a cathedral. It is instead a collection of whispers, a scattering of drawings and thoughts that he never showed to anyone. Feathers, wings, arcs and spirals and fragile frameworks made to lift a man off the ground. This book, this soft, nearly weightless book, holds the remnants of a dream that began long before Leonardo ever held a brush. It began when he was a boy in the hills of Vinci, lying in the grass, watching the sky, the way birds moved, the way clouds unfolded like slow sails, the way the wind seemed to carry its own voice. Now, decades later, that boy is an old man. His hair, once thick and gold like ripe wheat, is long and silver. His hands, once precise and untiring, now tremble softly as he turns a page. But his eyes still search the sky, even through the ceiling. Even in sleep, he does not speak much anymore. There are visitors, of course, courtiers and students, physicians and admirers. But they speak to him of fame, of work, of the past. No one asks him about the sky. No one knows that, at night, when the chateau is still and the fire has died, Leonardo opens this little book and traces his finger over the outline of wings. They are not realistic, these designs. Not anymore. They are not practical. They would not fly, but they are beautiful, impossibly so. There is something childlike in them, a softness, a surrender. These are not the sketches of a man trying to master the world. They are the musings of someone who wished only to leave it, not in death, but in flight. And in the candlelight, with the night whispering against the stone, it is easy to believe he might. That perhaps, in some quiet corner of time, Leonardo might step away from the desk, lift the book to his chest, walk out beneath the stars, and vanish into the wind. No goodbyes, no legacy, no applause. Just the quiet creak of a window, a gust of night air, and the fading shadow of a man with silver hair and paper wings. You do not need to understand flight to desire it. You do not need feathers to dream of them. And you do not need to finish everything to leave something eternal behind. The candle lowers, melting into itself, and the light it casts over the pages grows dim. But the dream is bright. It lives not in machines or monuments, but in these quiet lines, these weightless thoughts, these unspoken hopes. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind drifts like fog over a sleeping valley, know this: the greatest minds in history were not always chasing glory. Some were simply trying to lift themselves from the ground, gently, silently, like a whisper on the wind. And somewhere in that wind, Leonardo is still dreaming. There are minds that walk through the world as though they belong to it, tethered, grounded, shaped by its weight and rhythm. And then, there are minds that seem to hover just above it. Minds that are always elsewhere, looking beyond the surface of things, listening to songs no one else can hear. Leonardo da Vinci's mind was one of these. He moved through cities and courts, through crowded rooms and silent workshops, always present, yet not quite of this world. He studied the mechanics of locks while dreaming of clouds. He dissected human flesh and saw not just bone and muscle, but poetry hidden in the geometry of movement. And even as he painted the most earthly of smiles, his gaze wandered upward toward the sky. It was not escape he longed for, not exactly. Leonardo did not wish to leave the world behind in bitterness. He loved it too much. He loved its textures and patterns, its shadows and spirals, the curve of a petal, the way water twisted as it fell. But for all this love, he never quite felt that he belonged to it. He was, in many ways, born too early. The world he inhabited, the dusty, glorious warring world of Renaissance Italy, was not built for someone like him. It was a world of kings and priests, of wealth and violence, of rigid structures and loyal obedience. And Leonardo, with his questions, his experiments, his refusal to follow what was taught, simply because it was taught, he unsettled people. He puzzled them. He did not write in the usual way. He wrote backwards, from right to left, as if hiding his thoughts from those who might misunderstand them. His notebooks were private kingdoms, filled with sketches and ideas that flowed without boundaries. A horse mid-gallop beside a design for a siege machine, a study of a sunflower beside a mechanical angel. He painted rarely and never on demand. He could not be rushed. He left commissions unfinished, wandered off mid-project, lost not out of disrespect, but because his mind had already wandered elsewhere, to a new problem, a new curiosity, a different dream. Patrons were often frustrated with him. They called him unreliable. But how do you chain a mind that floats? Inside Leonardo lived a quiet contradiction. He yearned to understand everything, how things worked, why the stars moved as they did, how blood coursed through veins, what held a bird in the air. And yet, the more he knew, the more distant he seemed from the people around him. He could not marry his way into comfort, nor chase wealth with the focus others did. He dressed simply. He often ate alone. He befriended animals and walked with children. And in his solitude, he studied wings endlessly, not because he believed he could fly, but because he believed he should. The earth, to him, was beautiful, but limited. It held gravity, rules, obligations. The sky was freedom. It was mystery and silence, rhythm and grace. To fly would be to escape the noise of courtly life, the constraints of expectation. To fly would be to exist only in motion, in observation, in wind. And so, in the margins of his studies, in the quietest corners of his notebooks, he drew machines. Frames of wood and silk, gears that mimicked the beat of a bird's wings, pedals and levers and feathered limbs. Some were impossibly intricate, others almost childlike, but all of them shared one thing. They were not built for the battlefield or the gallery. They were built for the sky. There was a sadness in this dream, not a despair, but a melancholy. For Leonardo knew, deep down, that these machines would never truly fly. The physics were flawed, the materials too heavy, the understanding of lift incomplete. But that didn't matter, because the dream wasn't about success. It wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about longing itself, the act of desiring something just out of reach and allowing that desire to shape you. The way a plant bends toward the sun, even if it knows it may never touch it. The way a song lives in the throat, even if it is never sung aloud. Leonardo's mind was not content with what could be done. It lived in what might be possible, someday, somewhere, by someone. He planted seeds that would take centuries to grow, and he did so not out of vanity, but out of faith. Faith that someone, someday, would finish the flight he began. Even now, centuries later, when engineers and artists alike speak of him, They speak with a kind of reverence not for what he achieved, though he achieved much, but for what he attempted, for the way he allowed himself to dream beyond his tools, beyond his time. He was a man who spent his life observing the smallest details, the twitch of a caddis tail, the glisten on a petal, the way shadows curved on skin, while carrying in his chest a dream the size of the sky. And yet, he remained here, always here, on Earth. He built the shapes of wings, but never soared. He walked through palaces, but never stayed. He taught students, but never founded a school. He worked in silence, while the world roared around him. He watched the sky, but his feet never left the stone. A mind built for the sky, trapped on Earth. And perhaps in that tension, there is something beautifully human. For aren't we all a little like Leonardo? Don't we all carry within us a dream we cannot explain? A place we long to reach, but never touch? Something too vast to describe, too fragile to speak of? A longing that returns at night when the world is quiet and the candlelight flickers across the walls? Leonardo's dream was flight. Yours may be something else. But in the quiet, just before sleep, we all hear it. That soft voice that whispers of what might have been, what could still be. And in that whisper, we are not alone. Tonight, your body rests in stillness. The weight of the day dissolves slowly, like ink drifting in warm water. Your hands loosen, your shoulders soften. The room around you dims until only the sound of your breath remains. Gentle, steady, like wind through old olive trees. You do not need to move. Tonight, the world moves for you. Tonight you step into the final dream of a man whose thoughts never ceased, whose fingers were always drawing, building, wondering, and whose heart, even at the end of his long life, still beat in rhythm with something far above the earth. Leonardo da Vinci does not greet you with words. He does not need to. He is already walking ahead, not hurried, but drawn by some invisible thread. The hallway is long, made of cool stone and scattered light. Each step echoes faintly, as though time itself were listening. He is older now, older than you've ever imagined him. His robes are soft and simple. His silver hair falls past his shoulders in waves. His eyes are not bright with invention tonight. They are deep, quiet, and full of something far more tender, a longing that never left him. He leads you to a small wooden door. It opens without sound. Inside is a round room with curved walls and a domed ceiling painted with stars. There is no furniture, no papers, no books, only a single wooden stool, and at its center, a model suspended in the air. It turns slowly on a string of light. A flying machine, not real, not scaled, not tested, just imagined. You step closer. The wings are delicate, built of ideas. There are no gears, no screws, no heavy beams. Only the outline of motion, the suggestion of grace. It is not built to lift a body. It is built to hold a dream. Leonardo stands beside it, looking up, his hands behind his back. He says nothing. He doesn't need to, because you feel it too. That ache, that impossible yearning that all of us carry quietly. To be more than flesh, to be more than gravity. To be movement, wind, silence, and release. He closes his eyes. And for a moment, you see it. Not with your eyes, but with something deeper. As if the room itself begins to melt away. And in its place, the sky. Endless, blue-gray, full of slow clouds and golden light. Leonardo is younger now, but not young. He wears no name, no fame, no history. Only wings. Paper-thin, long, translucent, glowing with the light of dusk. He runs toward the edge of a quiet hill in Vinci, his bare feet brushing the grass. There is no audience, no celebration, only the wind and the birds circling above. He leaps, and for a moment that stretches like time held in honey, he does not fall. He floats, not in triumph, but in peace. Not to escape, but to arrive. He does not look down. He does not need to, because for the first time, he is not Leonardo the genius, the painter, the engineer, the philosopher. He is simply the boy who once watched swallows chase the sky and wondered if a human heart could follow. And in that moment, he does. The air surrounds him like an old friend. The wind slips beneath his arms, carries him, whispers to him, "You were always meant for this." The trees below are distant, the rivers slow and soft. The world becomes music without sound. He turns his face to the sun and smiles, not the mysterious smile of a portrait, but a real one that belongs only to him. And just as gently as the dream began, it begins to fade. The sky softens, the wind slows, the wings blur into light, and you are once again in the round room with the painted stars. But Leonardo is gone. Only the model remains, suspended, turning, shimmering in the quiet. You take a breath. The kind of breath that only comes when something within you shifts, even if just a little. You do not speak. You do not move. But a part of you has changed, as if some small, silent part of your soul had touched a dream and returned wiser. This was not just Leonardo's final dream. It was yours too. Because in every person, there is something waiting to fly, not to succeed, not to be seen, but simply to feel weightless, to be lifted by beauty alone. And so tonight, as you lie still and listen to the slow unfolding of your breath, know this: you are closer to the sky than you think. Not because you will rise from your bed and soar through the clouds, but because within your quiet, dreaming mind, you already are. The ceiling above you may be wood or stone or painted stars, but beyond it, in the soft corridors of sleep, the wind waits. The birds circle. The sky opens, and Leonardo is already there, floating, watching, dreaming. With you, before the notebooks, before the inventions, before the grand halls of Florence and the praise of kings, there was only Vinci, a quiet village nestled among the gentle, rolling hills of Tuscany. Olive trees lined the curved paths like old sentinels, their leaves silvering in the light of morning. The air was soft there, a blend of earth, wind, and the hum of things growing. Even the stones seemed to sleep more deeply in Vinci, as though the world had not yet fully awakened. And in this silence, a child wandered. He had no title then, no fame, no apprentices, no royal patrons, no brushes gilded with color or parchment filled with strange machines. He was simply a boy named Leonardo, born not in a palace, but outside the marriage of a notary and a country girl. A child of no official place, but every possibility. He did not speak much, even then. Not out of shyness, but because the world spoke to him first, through motion, texture, and soundless rhythm. While other children played and shouted and chased through the lanes, Leonardo would often slip away, past the olive groves, past the garden walls, toward the edge of the village, where the land rose into low, grassy hills. There, he would sit for hours, just watching, the way a lizard blinked slowly in the sun, the path an ant took as it carried a crumb 4 times its size. The lazy way clouds stretched and folded above him, as though the sky itself were breathing in sleep. These hills were his first classroom, not of facts or formulas, but of attention, the sacred art of seeing without needing to name. There were no clocks in Vinci, and no one called him back. The world, in those days, gave him space to wonder without interruption. And in that space, he began to teach himself a language not spoken aloud, the language of forms, of lines, of shadows moving across a petal. Sometimes he would lie on his back and look up through the branches of a fig tree, imagining how the veins of the leaves matched, the branches of rivers, the chambers of the heart, a split of lightning in the sky. To him, nothing was separate. The wind in the grass and the rustle of feathers in flight were not background noise. They were messages, patterns, quiet echoes of something larger. He did not know it yet, but he was already composing symphonies of thought, connecting movement, structure, feeling like threads woven into a tapestry only he could see. At times, he would sketch in the dirt with a stick, circles, wings, spirals, shapes he could not yet explain, but felt drawn to repeat. Even then, the motion of birds captivated him, the way they lifted, turned, and disappeared into the sky without sound. He would watch them with wide, dark eyes, not for play, but as if trying to understand a secret whispered only to those who observed without question. In Vinci, he learned something that would follow him for life. That silence was not emptiness. It was space. Space for noticing, space for wonder, space for the mind to expand without being pushed. It was the silence of the hills that taught him how to listen to the world before trying to change it. And in that listening, he began to understand that everything was connected. The flight of a bird was not just about feathers. It was about balance, about air and pressure and shape. It was about grace, about the quiet decision of a body to leave the earth and trust the wind. And perhaps Leonardo, in those early days, began to wonder not just whether a human could fly, but whether a human could learn to feel like a bird feels when it moves through the sky. What would it be like, he must have thought, to move not with intention, but with instinct, to rise not because of force, but because of harmony? These questions did not arrive as words. They came as sensations, as long stares into the distance, as the hum beneath his ribs when he saw a hawk rise in spirals through the warm air. Vinci gave him this, not knowledge, but the soil for which it could grow. The adults around him did not understand his silence. They saw his distance and thought it odd. They spoke of work, of trade, of the roles he might someday play. But Leonardo did not hear those roles calling to him. He heard only the wind, patient, persistent, calling him not upward, but inward, back to the hills, back to observation, back to a place where time bent gently and nothing was demanded of him. It was there that he first watched the flickering shadows of birds as they passed overhead, and imagined building wings not to conquer the air, but to join it, not to defeat gravity, but to understand it. Years later, when his hands were stained with ink and paint, when he walked the echoing halls of palaces and spoke in the language of anatomy, architecture, and philosophy, he would still sometimes close his eyes and see those hills. He would see the child he once was, sitting with dirt on his knees, eyes fixed on a dragonfly hovering above the creek. He would remember how still the air felt, how quiet the world had been before people expected answers. And in those moments, a soft smile would touch his face, a smile that belonged not to a master, not to a genius, but to a boy who had learned to see. And tonight, as you lie beneath your own ceiling, whether it is low or high, familiar or strange, you may feel some part of that silence reach you too. The silence of Vinci, the kind that carries no sound, but teaches everything. Let it surround you now. Let it hold you. You do not need to understand the world tonight. You only need to listen to it, with the same wide eyes Leonardo once raised to the sky, as the wind slipped gently over the hills, and the first feathered dream began to unfold. In the golden afternoons of Vinci, when the air hung warm and the sounds of village life drifted lazily through the fields, the children would gather in the open square. They would chase each other through the dust, climb trees with reckless joy, and laugh loudly under the Tuscan sun. But Leonardo was often somewhere else. Not far, sometimes just a few paces beyond the games, sitting cross-legged in the grass with a twig in his hand and his eyes turned skyward. While the others mimicked knights and shouted in play, Leonardo watched clouds. To some, it may have seemed like nothing, but to Leonardo, the clouds were everything. He studied them not as passing shapes, but as living forms. The way they billowed, the way they folded into themselves and unraveled again, slow, majestic, without effort. He saw elephants and ships, of course, like any child might. But he also saw motion, fluidity, the echo of water flowing in reverse. The breath of the earth turned visible. He did not just look at the sky. He listened to it. He let it move through him. Sometimes he would lie flat on his back, arms behind his head, letting the blades of grass tickle his neck, and he would trace the outlines of clouds with his finger, drawing invisible shapes in the air. Shapes that only he could see. Shapes that no one asked for, and no one needed to understand. He was not lonely. He was elsewhere. While the other children learned games of competition, Leonardo was learning to wait, to watch how a shadow stretched across the hill at a certain hour, how the wind shaped the dust when no one was walking, how the light curved around a leaf at sunset. He was learning patience, detail, and wonder. He kept pieces of charcoal in a pouch made of linen. When the moment felt right, he would find a stone or the side of a wall and begin to draw slowly, deliberately, not to impress, not to win praise, but because something inside him needed to come out. A curl of a cloud, the arc of a bird's wing, the way the light touched the horizon like a whisper. Sometimes the village children would pause their play and glance toward him. "What are you doing?" they'd ask. He would lift his head, offer a quiet smile, and simply say, "Looking." They would shrug and run off back to their games, while Leonardo returned to his sky, looking, always looking. It wasn't that he didn't want to join them, not exactly, but games felt temporary. The joy of chasing, of shouting, of pretending to be something you were not, it passed quickly. But the sky lingered. It moved at its own pace. It didn't shout. It didn't ask for anything. It simply offered itself, enormous and soft, like a story still being written. And Leonardo wanted to understand it. Even as a child, he sensed that everything in the world was telling a story, if only you knew how to listen. The clouds weren't just shapes. They were lessons. On motion, on softness, on how to be present without needing to be loud. And so he drew them, not just their forms, but their feelings. The way a thunderhead seemed heavy with secrets. The way a wisp of cirrus curved like a sigh. The way the entire sky could feel open or lonely, warm or distant, simply by the way the clouds arranged themselves. He was learning more than art. He was learning emotion through the natural world. And the earth became his mirror. On the days when the games grew rough or the village too loud, he would retreat to a favorite place. A small hill beyond the olive trees, with a single crooked pine standing like a sentinel at the top. From there, the valley stretched wide before him, and the sky seemed closer somehow, as if it dipped slightly just to greet him. There he would sit for hours, watching, sketching, not needing anything. Because in those moments, with charcoal in hand and silence all around, Leonardo felt as though he belonged to something larger. He didn't need explanations. He didn't yet know the names of muscles or the math of flight, but he knew feeling. And feeling, for him, was enough. He would return home with smudged hands and sleeves dusted in ash. His father, puzzled but curious, would ask him what he'd been drawing. "Clouds," Leonardo would say. "But they're gone," his father might reply. "How can you draw something that disappears?" Leonardo would smile, not with arrogance, but with quiet knowing. "Everything disappears," he'd answer. "That's why I try to keep it." He didn't mean to hold it forever, only long enough to understand. And so the habit grew, watching what others ignored, noticing what passed in silence, drawing clouds while the others played, not as a rejection of childhood, but as a deeper expression of it. Because in truth, Leonardo never stopped being a child. Even when his hands aged, even when the world called him a master, he remained that same boy beneath the crooked pine, tracing invisible patterns in the sky. And tonight, You are invited to join him. You do not need charcoal. You do not need hills. You only need your breath, your stillness, and a quiet willingness to see what others do not. Close your eyes now. Imagine the sky above Tuscany, soft, endless, full of stories that vanish before they finish. Imagine a boy sitting beneath them, sketching dreams made of vapor and light. And know that you, too, can draw clouds, not with your hands, but with your thoughts. And as your body softens and the world quiets, let your breath rise and fall like the shapes overhead. Let your mind drift slowly into a place where nothing must be held, only noticed. Because the most beautiful things in life, clouds, dreams, childhood, are not meant to last. They are meant to be remembered. It is said that our deepest dreams begin not with thoughts, but with images. Quiet moments that settle into the folds of our memory without ever announcing themselves. For Leonardo da Vinci, one of those moments was a bird. He did not yet know its name. He did not yet know the laws of physics or the diagrams of lift. He did not understand angles or aerodynamics or anatomy, but he remembered its wings. He remembered how the light caught them just so. He remembered the hush of the field when everything else faded, and only that bird remained, suspended in air as if it had chosen not to fall. Leonardo was small then, a child of 5, maybe 6, wandering the soft hills of Vinci. The air was cool, the grass high, and the sun dappled the earth with a golden kind of patience. He had been following ants, tracing their trails with his fingertip in the dust, when he heard it, the sudden rustle of feathers, the soft flutter just overhead. He looked up, and there it was. A kite, perhaps, or a kestrel, slender, sharp-winged, quiet in motion. It floated on the air like a whisper across silk, not flapping, not struggling, just gliding, effortless, a single arc drawn across the canvas of the sky. For a long time, Leonardo stood still. He did not blink. He did not breathe too loudly. Something in him, something not yet named, recognized a truth in that movement, a kind of grace he had never seen before. Not in the running feet of children, not in the stride of donkeys or the turning of windmills. This was different. This was flight, and the moment etched itself into him. He would recall it later as an old man in his notebooks. He would describe how he watched the bird wheel through the air, how it turned without force, how it seemed to understand the sky. He would write of it not as an observer, but as someone haunted, not by envy, but by awe. Because for Leonardo, that bird was not a symbol of escape. It was a symbol of belonging, of finding one's element. And somewhere, even as a child, he wondered, why couldn't a man belong to the air too? Why were we given eyes to follow the birds, but not the wings to join them? That question, simple and wordless then, would follow him like a quiet echo through his entire life. It would slip into his sketches, curl into the margins of his inventions, haunt the backs of his paintings. Even as he studied architecture, anatomy, and war machines, part of him remained in that field, under that sky, watching the bird that chose to stay aloft. He began, in small ways, to mimic it. When other boys threw stones, he threw leaves, watching how they twisted, floated, landed. When he saw a feather fall from the sky, he would catch it, turn it in his fingers, study the angles of its barbs, the curve of its spine. To others, it was a child's curiosity. To Leonardo, it was preparation. He wanted to understand not only how the bird flew, but why it did. What gave it permission to leave the ground? Was it the shape of its wings? The hollowness of its bones? Or something more abstract, a kind of surrender to the air? This was long before he had paper of his own, long before he knew that such questions would make him different. But even then, in those quiet afternoons, he began to sense that while other children might chase birds, he would follow them, not with his feet, with his thoughts. And so began a quiet fascination that never left him. Not even in his last days, when his eyes grew dim and his hands shook slightly with age, did he forget the motion of that first bird. He still remembered how it dipped a wing just so, how it circled, rose, and vanished into a sky that never looked the same afterward. That moment became a compass, not toward success, not toward recognition, but toward a dream shaped like feathers, light, impossible, persistent. And tonight, if you close your eyes and slow your breath, you may feel the same air on your skin. You may hear the hush of a single wing slicing through the sky. You may find yourself, like Leonardo, standing in a field of golden grass, watching a creature that does not fight gravity, but dances with it. And you may wonder, as he once did, what if I could do that too? Florence was no longer a distant idea on the horizon. It had become Leonardo's new reality. A city alive with marble dust, heated words, and the scent of pigment and metal. The boy from Vinci, barely in his teens, had arrived at the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected masters of his time. It was not a place of silence like the hills. It was full of hammering, of melting, of shouting across stone. But it was there, among bronze statues and frescoes half finished, that Leonardo learned how to create with his hands. The tools were foreign to him at first. Chisels heavier than expected, brushes stiff with dried color, scales and tongs that clanked together like impatient voices. He swept the floors, mixed paints, polished armor, ground minerals into powder. He watched more than he spoke. He watched everything. And quietly he began to draw. At night, when the others rested, Leonardo stayed behind. He sketched torsos and limbs, studied the twist of fabric, memorized the weight of muscle and motion. His drawings were different, not only accurate, but alive. A figure bent slightly in his sketches, not just because of anatomy, but because of intention. A hand reached not just outward, but toward something. Verrocchio noticed. He saw in Leonardo not just skill, but something harder to name. A softness, a hunger, a gentleness beneath precision. Soon, the young apprentice was asked not only to observe, but to assist, then to correct, and one day to paint. It was in a joint piece, the baptism of Christ, that Leonardo's touch became unmistakable. He was assigned a simple angel at the corner, a figure meant to complete the composition. But when the painting was done, the angel Leonardo painted looked different, lighter, almost as if it had just landed from the sky. The folds of the robe breathed. The face glowed not with divine power, but with quiet curiosity. Even the wings, though small, were rendered with an attention not seen before, as if he painted them not from imagination, but from memory. Verrocchio, it is said, was so moved, or perhaps humbled, that he never painted again. But for Leonardo, it was not pride. It was longing, because even in that moment, with brushes in hand and praise whispered in corners, he was still thinking of the bird, still thinking of the sky. He sketched mechanical systems for pumps and pulleys during the day, but at night, he drew wings, not the wings of angels, the wings of possibility. Soft, flexible structures, hinged arms, membranes stretched across delicate bones. His drawings were not mystical. They were intentional. Diagrams, really, like blueprints for a dream. And yet, even as he advanced, even as his skill deepened and his reputation grew, there was a quiet frustration within him. The tools were heavy. The world was practical. There were commissions to finish, statues to cast, gold to leaf. Florence expected results. But Leonardo, he expected wonder. He had come from a place where clouds taught him about patience. Now he was among men who measured success by speed and volume. Still, he stayed. Still, he worked. Because within the noise and the pressure, he had access to materials, to wood, to canvas, to copper, to paper, and in secret, he used them to feed the part of himself that never spoke. the part that watched birds and wondered how to follow. He was learning how to shape thought into form, learning how to take the silence of Vinci and translate it into machines that breathed. And though few around him understood, he kept building the dream, line by line, page by page, wing by wing. The commissions came more often now. Wealthy merchants, priests, nobles. They wanted portraits, altarpieces, allegories. And Leonardo, dutiful and disciplined, delivered. He painted folds of cloth so real, they seemed to ripple in the breeze. He rendered hands that looked as though they could touch you back. But somewhere, between the brushstrokes, his mind drifted. He could be painting a Madonna holding a child, divine, serene, sacred, and still, just beyond the visible, there would be a line, a shape, a curve in the margin, a wing, a hinge, a small mechanical note scrawled beneath the shadow of a drapery. The world saw beauty. Leonardo saw movement. While others studied form, he studied function. He would draw a hand, then wonder how it would grasp a feather mid-fall. He would study a foot, then imagine how it might press against air instead of earth. He painted eyes with such softness that you could almost feel their gaze. But what he longed to paint was the air around them, the invisible element that carried dreams upward. The wings were everywhere, tucked behind portraits, hidden in notebooks, outlined in the backs of receipts. He drew them not for fame, but for comfort. They were his secret language, the shape of freedom, the hope of something greater, the thing he reached for when the world demanded too much of him, because art, for all its glory, still held him to the ground. He wanted to leave the ground, not in defiance, but in belonging. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to return to something he had once glimpsed as a child beneath the Tuscan sky. And so, while painting the holy, he pursued the impossible. And in the margins, the quiet spaces no one else noticed, he built a world where men could fly. Leonardo never took the world at face value. To most, a wheel was a wheel. A door opened. A hand reached. A leaf fell. But for Leonardo, these were not simple facts. They were small miracles in motion, waiting to be understood. He believed that behind everything, there was a principle, a system, a story that could be drawn. He did not just want to see movement. He wanted to know it. Why does the wing turn when it catches the wind? How does a fish glide without sound? What makes a cat land silently from a leap? He would watch, sometimes for hours, the way water twisted as it poured from a jug. He would follow the winding paths of smoke rising from a candle. He would crouch near rivers to see how eddies swirled around a rock. Nothing was random to him. All of it carried meaning. He filled notebooks with these observations, drawings of muscles in tension, of birds mid-flight, of gears and pulleys mimicking tendons and joints. He measured, tested, revised. But even as he grew more precise, more technical, more brilliant in execution, his fascination remained emotional. He wasn't just studying movement. He was chasing grace. He was in love with that brief, elusive moment when force disappeared, and only flow remained, when a bird turned with the wind, when a dancer spun without effort, when a falling leaf drifted sideways in the sunlight. That was what he wanted to capture, not in cages, not in diagrams, but in form, a form that could be built, climbed into, and carried upward. His flying machines were not made of steel. They were made of longing. And though the materials were clumsy, wood, rope, parchment, the intention was always light, always toward the air, toward that single suspended moment when gravity forgets to pull. He studied motion so carefully, not because he wanted control, but because he wanted to join it. To understand was to participate, and so he kept drawing, wings, always wings, in notebooks, in margins, in his mind, even as he slept. Florence had long since faded behind him. The rolling hills of Vinci had become memory. And now Leonardo walked among shadows not of olive trees or slow-moving clouds, but of fortresses and armored men. Milan, in the late 15th century, was a place of ambition wrapped in stone, a city caught between brilliance and blood. It was here, in the court of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, that Leonardo found both opportunity and conflict. He had written to the Duke not as an artist, but as an engineer. In a letter that stretched 12 paragraphs long, Leonardo detailed his ideas not for portraits or sculpture, but for machines. Machines of war. Cannons that could scatter enemies with greater force. Bridges that could be built and taken down in moments. Weapons that could rain fire and steel from safe distances. It was a strange proposal, perhaps even shocking, for a man who loved the slow drift of birds and the silence of clouds. But Leonardo understood something others didn't. To gain time, to gain freedom, to gain the tools he needed, he would have to speak the language of power. And so he did. The Duke was impressed. Leonardo was hired. And the workshop he was given was unlike anything he had known. He had space, materials, assistants, models, time, and yet, in the quiet moments, when the city's noise softened and the candlelight drew gentle shapes on the wall, Leonardo's mind drifted, not to catapults or armored vehicles, but to wings. They were always with him. Even in Milan, among schematics of death and destruction, he drew wings, folded, spread, lifting from figures in flight. His notebooks, now filled with sketches of siege engines, suddenly gave way to designs for air screws and parachutes, for bird-like gliders and flying vessels, powered by men pedaling through the sky. It was as if two worlds lived within him, one made of gears and brass, the world expected by the court, by the dukes, by the needs of defense and dominion, and another made of silk and feather, the world he had carried since childhood, a place where gravity could be asked to let go, and man might float not with dominance, but with surrender. His war machines were brilliant. He designed mobile fortresses, rotating cannons, underwater breathing devices, and systems for flooding enemy trenches. He understood the mechanics of conflict better than many generals. And yet, none of these weapons were ever built. None of them left the page. Perhaps because they were too complex. Or perhaps because Leonardo never truly wanted them to succeed. To him, drawing war was an act of compliance. Drawing flight was an act of faith. And so, between tasks, he turned to his real work. He studied birds, pigeons, falcons, swifts, their wings in motion, the curve of their back, the timing of their lift. He filled pages with notations about the weight of feathers, the tension of ligaments, the pressure of wind beneath a turning wing. He dissected them, not out of cruelty, but out of reverence. He wanted to understand how a hollow bone supported such life, how a creature so delicate could rise with such certainty. He began to design his own flying machines, not in secret, but in solitude. They were unlike anything the world had seen. Frames shaped like dragonfly wings, seats suspended in delicate cages, ropes and pulleys controlled by arms and legs, by breath and timing. There were no engines, no fuel, only man and motion and hope. Hope that the sky might become a road, hope that dreams could be drawn into being, hope that peace might be something we build, not beneath our feet, but around us in air. He worked tirelessly, measured, sketched, tested. The machines were never perfect. Some failed before they were finished. Others were too heavy, too complex. He lacked the materials. He lacked the understanding. The laws of lift were not yet known. But none of that stopped him, because in each attempt, he moved closer to something deeper than flight. He moved closer to stillness, to harmony, to the feeling he had once known as a child, lying in a field beneath the open sky, watching a bird hover without effort. He longed for that again, and Milan, for all its splendor and gold, for all its architects and armor and praise, could not give it to him. So he searched in silence, while soldiers marched, while dukes plotted, while cities prepared for siege. Leonardo dreamed. He dreamed not of victory, but of levitation, not of conquering others, but of rising with them, of escaping gravity, not to dominate the earth, but to leave it kindly. He had once told a friend, in a whisper shared in a warm room, lit by a single candle, when once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward. And though he had never flown, not with wings, not with machines, not with anything but his mind, he had tasted it. In dreams, in sketches, in the longing that lived in the quiet center of his chest. He never told the Duke. He never wrote it in a letter, but his notebooks knew. They held the truth of him, folded into pages, hidden between diagrams of war. They knew that peace was not something to be signed or won, but imagined. And Leonardo imagined it in the shape of wings. Tonight, as you breathe slower, as your limbs grow heavy and your thoughts drift gently into fog, imagine with him. Not the noise of battle, not the weight of armor, but the hush of wind above a sleeping world, the pause before lift, the moment when a man who had designed for kings finally dreamed for himself. And in that dream, there were no weapons, only sky. There were days when Leonardo da Vinci seemed to be more than one person, one man, standing before a canvas, brush in hand, carefully blending shadows over a delicate smile. Another, hunched over a table, eyes narrowed, sketching wings, levers, and impossible machines in the quiet margins of paper. He lived split between beauty and longing, between the real and the imagined, between what he was asked to create and what he needed to dot Florence once again shimmered around him, full of color and commission. Patrons knocked at his door. Nobles requested portraits. Religious leaders demanded sacred scenes, frescoes to be finished, altarpieces to be revised. Wealthy families wanted themselves immortalized in oil, clothed in dignity and grace. And Leonardo, with his unmatched hands, delivered dot with one stroke. He captured the softness of skin, the depth of eyes, the gentle way fingers touched fabric. His Madonnas were not cold icons, they breathed. His saints were not distant ideals, they paused in human thought. His portraits seemed to listen to the viewer, holding some quiet wisdom just beyond words. But there was always something else dot behind. The easel, beneath the pigments, within the silence between commissions. Another Leonardo worked, invisible to the world that praised him. That Leonardo still dreamed of wings. He kept a pile of notebooks always nearby, battered, ink-stained, overflowing. While the apprentices cleaned brushes or prepared canvases, Leonardo might pause mid-painting, set down his palette, and pick up his pen. A curve, a gear, a frame shaped like a swallow's ribcage. The motion was seamless, as if his hand did not know how to rest, only how to move from form to form, from cheekbone to feather, from light to lift, from divine to designed. He could spend hours painting the glint in an eye, and moments later be lost in the sketch of a man-powered glider. The transition was not a break. It was a rhythm. Art was what the world saw. Flight was what he felt. Some say this was distraction, that he lacked discipline, that his mind was scattered. But they misunderstood. Leonardo did not divide his time. He braided it. He was not painting instead of dreaming. He was painting through it. Each hand that held a brush also held the memory of feathers. Each stroke on canvas carried a whisper of wind. Each piece of drapery he rendered so precisely echoed the curve of a wing he could not yet build. And when the world grew loud with demands, with expectations, with the heavy praise of those who wanted only what they could hang on. Wall. He turned inward to his notebooks, to the sketches that no one commissioned, because there, in those pages, he was free. Free to design machines that would never fly, free to invent shapes that defied logic, free to imagine a body not burdened by weight, but lifted by understanding. He wrote notes in mirror script, from right to left, not to be mysterious, but perhaps because some part of him wanted to speak only to himself. The world around him wanted miracles they could measure. But Leonardo's greatest miracle was never shown. It was his quiet belief that man could rise, that we could build not to dominate, but to join the sky. He began designing a full-scale ornithopter, a flying machine powered by a human body, mimicking the flapping motion of birds. He imagined the harness, the tension in the cords, the frame of wood and cloth, the push of muscles against gravity. Every line was drawn with care, every note marked with reverence. He did not yet know it would fail, and maybe he didn't need to know, because the act of drawing was the act of reaching, the act of hoping. And hope, to Leonardo, was never wasted. He painted the divine in others, but when he sketched wings, he painted the divine in himself. The two halves of his life were not at odds. They were reflections. In his art, he honored the body. In his machines, he honored its potential. And even though the world rarely saw the wings, even though his patrons never asked, and his peers never truly understood, he carried them with him, always. Folded, hidden. But present. Like a dream tucked into a coat pocket. And so he painted, and so he drew. One hand creating what the world celebrated, the other chasing what his heart refused to forget. Because sometimes the greatest works are not the ones we finish, but the ones we keep returning to. Tonight, as your body rests and your breath falls into rhythm, imagine Leonardo at his desk. The candles flicker low, the paint is drying, the room is still, and there he is, sketching quietly, a line, then another, as the figure of a wing takes shape again beneath his hand. He does not speak, he does not rush. He only draws, because even if it never flies, the dream deserves to be drawn. Asterisk, asterisk, the sky is filled with creatures that know things we don't, not just birds, with their graceful arcs and effortless dives, but others too, stranger, quieter, more ancient. Leonardo knew this, while others admired. The hawk or the swan, he paid close attention to the bat. It was not beautiful in the way people wanted beauty. It did not glide with elegance or fan its wings for display. It flew in shadows. It flitted. It folded. It darted through the dusk in silence and vanished again before the mind could grasp its motion. And yet, for Leonardo, the bat held answers no one else was looking for. He had spent years sketching birds, dissecting them carefully, following the curve of each feather, noting how tendons contracted with every beat of the wing. He had studied how air flowed beneath their bodies, how their tails shifted subtly to adjust direction. It was a dance, and he had learned its choreography. But something was missing. Birds had feathers. Birds had beaks. Birds were built to fly. Their grace was natural, evolved, expected. But what about the bat? A creature of fur, of soft skin stretched over, bones of fingers extended into membrane? The bat wasn't meant to fly, and yet it did. So Leonardo, with the reverence of a scholar and the heart of a poet, turned to it. He studied them carefully. When he found one, often tangled in netting or fallen in a corner of a building, he would observe first how it moved, how it crawled, how it hung from its feet like a secret. Then, when it was still, he would trace its wings with his fingers. Gently, the bones were long and thin, like stretched hands. The skin was soft but strong, tight but flexible. And within that fragile architecture, Leonardo saw something he hadn't found in feathers. Saw design, not aesthetic design, but adaptive design. Efficiency, precision. The bat's wing did not rely on beauty. It relied on relationship. The relationship between form and function. Between stretch and support. Between structure and softness. It was this realization that shifted his thinking. He had long imagined flight as something noble, something poetic, something light and grand. But the bat reminded him that flight could also be functional, tense, practical, not always, elegant, but effective. So he began to adjust his machines. He sketched new frames inspired by the bat's bones, long supports that mimicked fingers, joints that could bend and flex with purpose. He imagined ways for fabric to stretch and contract as the wings moved. He studied how the bat pulled its wings close to turn, then extended them fully to glide. In his notebooks, you can see the change. The wings become less decorative, more skeletal, more real. He began to write detailed notes about how to replicate that tension, how to create a structure that wasn't stiff, but alive in motion. Something that moved like breath, that responded like skin, and always quietly beneath these notes, a kind of reverence. He did not mock the bat's strangeness. He admired it, because to Leonardo, nature was never wrong. Even the odd, the overlooked, the misunderstood, all of it held truths. All of it held possibility. And the bat, strange as it was, had figured out something that no man had. How to defy the earth without feathers. How to dance through the dark. How to become flight by sheer will of structure. That idea that a creature could construct its way into the sky felt closer to Leonardo than anything else. He too was not born for flight. He too had no wings. But perhaps with enough understanding, with enough observation, he could build something that carried him anyway. He saw in the bat a version of himself. Misunderstood. UNCELEBRATED. Holding a secret no one else had dared to notice. And so he kept drawing, again and again, the wings. Sometimes small and tight, like folded fabric. Other times wide and open, each segment clearly labeled, a system of tension and release. He wrote of materials, how fine linen might mimic skin, how thin rods of willow could serve as bones. He pondered how to create movement through petals, how to store and release energy as a bat does through its musculature. But more than that, he wrote of motion, because what fascinated him most wasn't that bats could fly. It was how they did it, not through strength, but through timing. Balance. Rhythm so tuned to the air that even the awkward could become graceful. And in the quiet of his studio, surrounded by paint, clay, and calculations, Leonardo began to believe that the dream of flight did not belong only to the beautiful. It belonged to the thoughtful. To the quiet. To the ones who studied what others dismissed. It belonged to those who watched not only the eagle, but the bat, because the sky did not choose favorites. Welcomed anything that understood how to move within it. And tonight, as you lie still, listening to the hush of your breath, perhaps you can feel it too, the shift of air above your chest, the silence that surrounds your thoughts, the rhythm of wings that beat not for glory, but simply for the joy of motion. Close your eyes. Imagine the shape of a bat's wing, soft, steady, purposeful. Now, imagine that shape opening slowly from your back. No noise. No effort. Only the unfolding of something long held in your chest. And know that, like Leonardo, you do not need feathers to rise. Only the patience to listen and the courage to try. Asterisk. In a quiet corner of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, there is a drawing, unlike the others. It is careful, even restrained. Not as fantastical as some of his inventions, not as elaborate as his stage designs or military machines. There is no excessive detail, no flamboyance, just a form, a shape, a suggestion of something held between dream and design. A machine meant to fly. Its wings are broad, arched gently like the back of a bird mid-glide. The body is narrow, almost fragile. The seat is placed at the center, where a man would lie on his stomach, his arms and legs strapped to levers, his movements meant to mimic the rhythm of a bird in motion. He called it the ornithopter, and he never built it. Not once did its wooden ribs touch the air. Not once did its frame stretch taut with silk or canvas. Not once did its wings beat in the wind. It lived, and still lives, entirely on paper. But for Leonardo, that was enough. He drew it again and again. Each iteration slightly changed, an altered curve, an improved hinge, a stronger support. He measured its angles meticulously, calculated the force of a man's limbs, studied how motion could be translated into lift. But he never brought it into the world, not because he doubted it, not because he feared failure, but because, perhaps, some dreams are too sacred to test. The ornithopter wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol, a silent testimony to the part of him that still stood on the hill in Vinci, watching a bird float through the sky without effort. That memory, soft and distant, had never left him. It had taken shape in this design, the wish of a man who understood gravity better than most, and still dared to believe it could be softened. Leonardo knew his machine wouldn't work, or at least, not yet. The materials were too heavy, the muscles of a man too weak, the understanding of aerodynamics too early. But even so, he drew it, not out of ambition, but out of devotion. Devotion to a question he could never stop asking. What if? What if we could build something not to conquer the sky, but to join it? What if flight was not a privilege of birds, but a right of thought? What if a mind, with enough care, could shape a body into something that lifted? There's something gentle in the way he rendered it. No armor, no weapons, no loud proclamation of success. Just quiet lines. A figure, a wing, a dream, folded neatly into the margins of history. Even now, centuries later, when engineers study his designs, when historians debate their purpose, when books are written about their flaws or foresight, the ornithopter remains. Still unafraid, unashamed, unrealized, and yet somehow complete, because Leonardo was not trying to build flight. He was trying to become a and in that sense, he succeeded. The machine never left the paper, but the dream escaped it long ago. It moved from the ink on the page to the imagination of every person who has ever longed to float above the noise of the world. It moved into the quiet moments between thinking and doing, where ideas are allowed to exist without being judged by their function. And perhaps that's where flight begins, not in physics, but in stillness. In a man, alone in a workshop, drawing wings with the same care he used to render the gaze of a saint, not for profit, not for praise, but because something inside him refused to stay grounded. Leonardo had built so much in his life, paintings that changed how we see the human face, studies of anatomy that pulled back the skin of mystery, machines that hinted at futures we're only now beginning to understand. But this machine, this one he left alone, and in doing so, he gave it a different kind of power, because there is something eternal in the unrealized. It does not break, does not fail. It waits. And tonight, as you breathe slower, as your eyes begin to soften, as your body surrenders to gravity in the quiet safety of your bed, think of that machine, not in a museum, not behind glass, but resting in a book, in a drawer, in a quiet room. Waiting. Still drawn. Still perfect. Still possible. and know that not every dream needs to be built. Some only need to be imagined, with enough love, enough clarity, and enough patience to let them live exactly where they were. Always meant to dot in the still air, not on the page dot, in the part of us that still looks up and wonders, what if? Asterisk, asterisk. Long before the age of engines, turbines, or jet-fueled flight, there was a man drawing wings by candlelight, not for war, not for transport, not even for science as we know it, but for beauty. Leonardo da Vinci's ornithopter was never a machine in the traditional sense. It was not born of efficiency or urgency. It did not answer a call to arms or serve a king's ambition. It was born, instead, of something older, something quieter, a longing, the longing to rise not as a bird does, because it must, but as a man might. Simply because he dreams of it. In every line of the ornithopter, there is a kind of softness, a restraint, a grace that cannot be explained by numbers. The wings are curved like the petals of a flower caught mid-bloom. The frame, though firm, moves like a reed in water. There is no harshness in its structure, no brute force, just balance, just breath. Leonardo envisioned the human body as the engine. A person would lie flat on the belly, arms and legs connected to pulleys and cranks, moving in a rhythm designed to mimic the flapping of a bird. The energy would come not from fire or steam, but from intention, from the motion of a human being choosing, moment by moment, to lift himself above the earth. It was, in every sense, poetic engineering. And that was the point. To Leonardo. Beauty was not a luxury. It was not an afterthought. It was function. A machine, he believed, could not work unless it moved like something alive, unless it reflected the forms of nature, unless it sang silently, in harmony with the world around it. And so the ornithopter was drawn not with hard lines, but with care. With love, like a lullaby made visible. He didn't design it to replace walking, or to rush commerce, or to impress the courts. He designed it to become something that had never existed before, a body in the air, moving like it belonged there. Because in birds, he saw not just freedom, but precision. And in flight, he saw not just escape, but union. Union between man and wind. Between thought and motion. Between the dream and the hand that dares to draw it. Leonardo believed deeply that every invention must honor the world it hopes to enter. That to fly, one must first deserve the sky, not by conquering it, but by mirroring it. That's why he returned to the ornithopter again and again, not to improve its function. But to refine its soul. There are pages in his notebooks where he draws only the curve of the wing, over and over. Just that one line, the arc that would rise first against the wind. He tests it gently, adjusts the taper, considers the balance of resistance and flow, not because it would guarantee flight, but because it was beautiful. And to Leonardo, beauty was the closest thing to truth. He never rushed its completion, never forced its construction. In fact, he may have known, all along, that it wouldn't work, that human muscles could not generate enough lift, that materials of his time were too heavy, too rigid, too crude, but he drew it anyway, again and again, because the act of drawing was not a means to an end. It was the end. To trace that wing, to imagine its motion, to give it a home on paper. That was the miracle. That was flight, even if it never left the ground, even if no one ever built it. The ornithopter became a meditation, a quiet repetition of a question without an answer, a devotion, not to progress, but to possibility, a gesture of hope shaped like a machine. And now, centuries later, when we look at those sketches, we feel something deeper than admiration. We feel recognition. We know, in some unspoken part of ourselves, that this was not a blueprint. It was a prayer A prayer to the sky, dot to gentleness, dot to grace. And isn't that what dreams are? Not destinations, but gestures, dot not demands, but dances, dot not engines, but wings, drawn in stillness, lit by candlelight, waiting not to be proven, but to be felt. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the ornithopter above you, hovering not in the air, but in thought, floating like a leaf, silent, waiting, not to carry you away, but to remind you that there is beauty in the attempt, that you do not need to rise to be lifted, that you do not need to succeed to be sincere, that you, too, can draw your own wings, in your own way, in your own time, and let them live quietly in the space between breath and dream. Because sometimes the most beautiful things in life were never meant to fly. They were only meant to be imagined. Asterisk. It is easy to romanticize flight, dot, to imagine it as lightness, as grace, as effortless floating through clouds. But Leonardo da Vinci knew better. He knew that behind the elegance of a bird in motion, there was work. There were muscles, taut, coordinated, rhythmic, performing a dance so complex that it appeared simple. And he longed to understand that dance, dot, not only from afar, not only as a watcher of wings, but from within. He wanted to be the bird, or at least to understand what. It meant to move like one dot, to rise not through magic, but through muscle, through the coordinated contract and release of tendons, through the stretch of bone, the tension of sinew, the delicate timing of flex and fold. And so, he studied, dot, not just feathers, not just lift, but the mechanics of flight. Leonardo dissected dozens of birds, carefully, reverently, always in silence. He opened their bodies not to destroy, but to reveal. Beneath the softness of their exterior, he traced systems of motion so refined they seemed divine. He sketched what he saw. The breast muscles, thick and powerful, that pulled the wings. Down, the slender ligaments along the shoulder that controlled angle and arc. The hollow bones, not brittle, but strong, made lighter by their emptiness. He followed these systems with the precision of a surgeon and the wonder of a child. And then, he turned inward. He studied the human body. He asked, do we have what they have? Could the human chest, with training, simulate the movement of a bird's? Could our arms replicate wings, not in form, but in function? Was there, buried beneath our earthly frame, the memory of flight? He began drawing human bodies with wings, not metaphorically, not mythically, but practically. Shoulders with modified joints, arms strengthened by gears and pulleys, chests supported by mechanical frames, legs folded into the body like the tucked claws of a falcon. In descent, dot, he did not dream of riding in a machine. He dreamed of becoming one, but not cold. Not industrial, dot, a machine made of muscle and will, a machine of breath, of motion, of choice. He imagined a man suspended horizontally, limbs strapped into a frame that would respond to every contraction and extension. A man who, through precise effort, could create rhythm, the same rhythm a bird uses to balance lift and thrust, not flapping wildly, but pulsing gently, like breathing through the air. He wrote notes, thousands of words, about how each muscle would behave, not how long a man could sustain the movement. What muscles would need to be strengthened, dot, what balance must be maintained to avoid collapse. He imagined the pain, the fatigue, the discipline required, dot. He knew it would not be easy, but he believed it might be possible, not in his lifetime, but perhaps someday, dot. And so he kept drawing, again and again, not just wings, but the body that would carry them, dot. He refused to separate the mind from the form. To him, a machine that flew was not enough. It had to respond, to live, to feel, dot, because Leonardo believed that flight was not a singular event. It was a system. A conversation between air and muscle, between pressure and movement, between risk and surrender. And more than anything, he wanted to listen to that conversation, Dot, to hear what it would say to a man willing to try. Some nights, after long hours of sketching and studying, he would lie flat on a wooden board, arms stretched, outward, eyes closed. He would imagine the machine attached. He would imagine the resistance, the movement, the trembling of muscles pushing against air. He would imagine himself as a bird, not majestic Dot, not flawless Dot, but determined Dot. And in that moment, he would smile, softly, privately, not because he had solved the puzzle, but because he had honored it. He had given it time, Dot, he had given it breath. And perhaps, in some quiet way, he had felt flight not in the sky, but in the intention, Dot, because that's where flight truly begins, Dot, not in feathers, not in machines, but in muscles, the muscles we use to dream, to reach, to try. Tonight, as you lie still, your own muscles at rest, imagine Leonardo at the edge of his table, candlelight flickering, pages spread like wings around him, hands open, fingers loose. His drawings are finished for the night, but his mind still floats, Dot, in the slow beat of imagined wings, Dot, in the pull of invisible chords, Dot, in the deep rhythm of the body asking, what if we could lift ourselves? And in that question, he does not expect an answer. Only silence, only stillness, only sleep. Asterisk, asterisk, Leonardo da Vinci often looked upward, but not in the way others did, Dot, to most. The sky was a veil that hid the heavens, a sacred curtain between the earthly and the divine. Artists painted angels floating in it. Priests spoke of souls ascending through it. Philosophers debated what lay beyond it. But Leonardo? He wasn't interested in what was beyond the sky. He was entranced by the sky itself, its color, its behavior, its movement, the way it seemed to breathe lightning in the morning, glowing at dusk. He loved the patterns of birds against its vastness, the curls of mist that danced through its folds, and the way clouds seemed to form thoughts. He did not romanticize it. He analyzed it. He saw it as a field, a medium, a space of mechanics, Dot, too. Him, the sky was not holy, it was tangible. A place governed by pressure, wind, lift, humidity, force. He studied it like he studied the body, piece by piece, system by system, that he wrote about why the sky appears blue centuries before light. Scattering was understood. He observed the way clouds behaved before a storm. He documented how birds changed their flight patterns based on altitude and air resistance. His notes speak not of the sky as mystery, but as invitation, Dot, an invitation to understand, Dot, and someday to enter, but not to escape, not to rise like a saint or angel. Leonardo did not want to fly to leave the world behind. He wanted to fly within it. The sky was not an escape. It was an extension. That's why his obsession remained with the atmosphere, with the actual, measurable layer of air that surrounded the Earth. He wrote extensively about air density, temperature gradients, the behavior of gases. He performed rudimentary experiments, dropping objects from towers, observing how smoke curled in windless rooms, watching how candlelight flickered in tight spaces. He compared the behavior of wind to the flow of water, believing both were governed by similar principles. This led him to map air currents like river systems, sketching invisible motion into visible forms. He once said that movement revealed truth, and nothing moved like the sky, Dot. It could be gentle or brutal, still or chaotic. It could cradle the wings of a dove or tear a tree from its roots. And somewhere between those extremes, Leonardo imagined a space of balance, a narrow path where man and machine could exist, could glide, could stay. He began to sketch flight, paths not of birds, but of possible machines. He studied how speed affected angle, how thrust changed depending on the wind, His notebooks are filled with imagined wind tunnels, rotating wings, gliding frames. Still, he knew the risk. The sky, for all its softness, could not be trusted. It changed without warning. It punished arrogance. And so he respected it not as a god, but as a force. He designed tests for his ideas using miniature models. He dropped them from heights. He tried to glide them across ropes. He even imagined a man suspended from the ceiling, practicing muscle movements to mimic a bird's wing. Somewhere in all of this, he fell in love with the sky's imperfection, its unpredictability, its refusal to obey. He admired that because Leonardo, in truth, had never trusted perfection. He found more beauty in cracks than in marble, more wonder in incomplete ideas than in polished ones. The sky reminded him that nothing was ever finished, that every system, no matter how studied, still bathed with chaos. And so, he returned to it every morning, every night, looking upward, not with prayer, not with hope, but with questions. He didn't ask, "What's up there?" He asked, "How does it work?" And then he listened to the breeze whispering against his studio window, to the flutter of birds outside his door, to the sigh of vole. Clouds shifting above the rooftops of Florence. It was a quiet obsession, but one that stayed with him, even when his sketches grew weary, even when his hands slowed, even when others looked to the stars, to God, to mystery. Leonardo kept his eyes on the sky, because to him, it was the most human thing there was, changeable, elusive, full of motion and memory. And in that, he saw himself, a man not dreaming of heaven, but of air. And how it might carry a soul not to escape the world, but to understand it from above for just one moment, and then return. Asterisk. There was a small hill, barely marked on any map, nestled in the folds of the Tuscan countryside. It was not famous. No battles had been fought there, no kings buried, no saints canonized. It was just a hill, quiet, steady, always watching me. Sky. Leonardo had discovered it as a child, long before he became Leonardo da Vinci. Back then, he was simply a curious boy from Vinci, wandering alone, barefoot, chasing dragonflies, and wondering why the world moved the way it did. This hill became his favorite place. He would climb it slowly, through olive groves and whispering grasses. He liked the way it rose gently, not in grandeur, but in grace. At the summit, the world opened up, valleys unfolded like ancient scrolls, and the sky stretched endlessly above. But it wasn't the view that brought him back. It was the wind up there. The wind was different. It didn't just blow. It taught. On that hill, Leonardo learned that the wind had textures. Sometimes it was thick, like wool tugging against his skin. Other times it was thin and sharp, slicing like a whisper through trees. He felt it tug at his clothes, circle around. His ears spiral up his arms and vanish. It played, it tested him. He began to bring scraps of cloth to the hill, holding them high, watching how they danced. He made paper pinwheels and rudimentary kites, tying them to sticks and letting them tremble in the current. He crouched low in the grass, observing how leaves responded. He sketched birds as they struggled against gusts, noting how they adjusted mid-flight with micro-movements of tail and wing. He began to mimic those motions with his arms, standing on the hilltop, flapping slowly, earnestly, as though he might actually lift. He never told anyone. It was a private ritual, one that repeated through the years after studies, after apprenticeships, after long days in Florence or Milan. He returned to that hill again and again, even as a man full of knowledge and renown. Because on that hill, he wasn't the master, he was the student. The wind remained his teacher, and its lessons were gentle, but profound. It showed him that motion was never constant. It pulsed, surged, retracted. That balance wasn't found in stillness, but in constant correction. That nature wasn't cruel, only indifferent, and that understanding it meant moving with it, not against. He began to map the hill, not for its geography, but for its air, where the wind changed direction, where it grew quiet, where it played tricks. He drew diagrams, spiral notations, arrows and symbols that only he understood. He would sit with his eyes closed, feeling the direction of the wind on his cheek, naming its origin, estimating its speed. He trained his body to recognize it the way a musician recognizes a note. Not just the pitch, but its color, its weight, its emotion. And then one day, on that same hill, he brought with him a bundle of wood, fabric, and wire. It was not a finished invention. It was a question with wings. He assembled it gently, reverently laying it flat on the ground like a sleeping creature. It had no engine. It had no power, but it had form, elegance, the idea of lift embedded in its frame. He sat beside it for hours, waiting, listening, not for applause or discovery, but for the right gust, a gust that would answer him. When it came, he lifted the frame and ran downhill, letting the wind take it briefly from his fingers. It rose just slightly before, tumbling gracelessly into the grass. He laughed, not with disappointment, but with understanding. He wasn't there to succeed. He was there to ask and the wind had answered honestly, try again. So he did, over and over for years. He refined his designs, made new models, watched birds from that same hill, now through aged eyes, but with the same child's wonder. He never flew, not truly, but he came close in other ways. In sketches, in dreams, in understanding. That hill became sacred to him, not for what it offered, but for what it never promised. Flight, for Leonardo, was never about defying nature. It was about listening to it so deeply, so patiently, that it might reveal a narrow path forward, a path made not of wings or feathers, but of faith. Faith in wind, faith in questions, faith in the strange language of motion that only silence could translate. And on quiet evenings, when the sun bent low and the sky turned soft with gold, Leonardo would lie back on that hill, arms stretched, wide, eyes half closed, and let the wind wash over him. For a moment, he felt weightless, not because he had flown, but because he had finally understood what it meant to let go. Asterisk, asterisk, the dream came to him one night, not long after he had spent a long afternoon studying the twist of a maple seed falling through the air. Leonardo had been sitting on a worn stone bench in the garden of a monastery in Milan, staring at a seed that had fallen from the branches above. At first, he thought nothing of it, but when it landed, spinning, dancing, floating longer than seemed possible, he blinked and leaned closer. The seed moved like it wanted to stay in the air. It didn't fight gravity. It partnered with it. It spiraled, slowly, beautifully controlled. Not by force, but by grace. That night, as he slept under flickering candlelight and the soft creak of old wooden beams above his chamber, the dream came. In it, he was standing on the edge of a vast cliff, arms wrapped in a harness of linen and cedar, with a spiral wing coiled above him like a nautilus unfurling toward the stars. The air was soft, the sky a deep, impossible violet. He stepped forward. The wind did not lift him. It waited. Patient. And then he spun, not like a falling stone, but like that maple seed, a slow, steady spiral downward. He wasn't falling. He was descending in rhythm with the sky. Each turn of the spiral felt like a heartbeat, each beat a breath, each breath a promise. You are held. He awoke slowly, not with a jolt, but with the sensation of still spinning, even as his body remained still in the sheets. And when the dream faded, he rushed to his table and began to draw. The lines came in curves, wider at the base, tighter at the tip. He sketched a cone, a screw, almost but inverted, delicate, hollow. He imagined it not as a machine to rise with brute force, but one that seduced the air, swirled with it, coaxed lift not by opposition, but by invitation. Thus, the helical air screw was born. It wasn't just a design, it was a message from the dream. He built models, tiny at first, paper, wax, cloth stretched over thin frames. He watched how they spun when dropped, how the air pushed against their curves. He whispered to them as they descended, murmuring soft encouragements like a father to a child, learning to walk. He believed this spiral was nature's signature. He saw it in the curl of a wave, in the twist of a shell, in the turning of a galaxy. Spirals were not chaos, they were guidance. The universe was built in turns, not lines, and so should man's flight be. His notebooks became filled with variations of the spiral wing. Side views, cutaways, pages upon pages of diagrams, each more refined, more alive. Some dismissed it as folly, but Leonardo did not care, because this dream, this spiral, was not just about flight. It was about the shape of ascent, a reminder that upward motion is rarely straight. It turns, folds, spins, hesitates like life, like thought, like sleep. He imagined a full-size spiral wing tall, almost like a turret, with 4 men at the base, cranking the spiral with synchronized rhythm. The movement would generate lift, at least in theory, enough to raise it from the ground, enough to imitate the seed that first inspired it. But even if it didn't rise, the machine would still be beautiful. That mattered. Because for Leonardo, beauty and science were siblings born from the same curiosity, fed by the same wonder. In the spiral wing, he saw both, a question in motion, a dream you could build. He once wrote, "When once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward." The spiral wing was his way of tasting it through dream, through design, through devotion. He never flew in it, no one did, but that didn't matter, because the act of imagining it, the meticulous hours spent shaping, reshaping, understanding meant he had already soared. In mind, in memory, in sleep. And perhaps that's where flight truly lies, not in altitude, but in intention. In how we see the air, how we ask the wind to meet us halfway. And how we spiral, slowly, toward the stars. Asterisk, asterisk. It was a quiet evening in Amboise, and the stone walls of the manor where Leonardo spent his final years held the golden hush of twilight. The shutters were closed against the wind, but a single window remained open in his study, where a flickering candle leaned toward the fading light. On his desk lay a parchment, neither a sketch nor a blueprint, but something far simpler, a letter, not addressed to anyone. No seal, no name, just words, carefully placed, written in his distinctive mirrored script, though this time less for secrecy and more for rhythm. Leonardo had always felt his thoughts flowed better from right to left, as though he were pulling them from the soul rather than pushing them forward. This letter was not for a patron. Not for a king, not for his notebooks or his pupils. It was meant for the sky. He had never sent it, never folded it, never tried to float it away on the wind, but he wrote it with the same devotion he gave to his machines, his studies, his paintings. In it, he spoke of longing, a longing not for fame or mastery, but for weightlessness, not just of body, but of burden. He wrote of the feeling that had followed him since childhood, that the air itself held secrets. If only one could rise high enough to whisper with the clouds. He spoke to the sky as an old friend, a friend who had never answered, yet had always listened. "You have kept me company," he wrote, "when men could not." He thanked the sky for the birds, for the storms, for the way morning fog curled around the hills like soft arms, for the taste of air before the rain, for the invisible hand that tousled his hair when he walked alone at dawn. He admitted something, to something he never told anyone else, that he had dreamed of falling, far more than he dreamed of flying Dot. And in those dreams, the fall never hurt Dot. It felt like surrender, like trust. Dot, like the world, had finally agreed to hold him. He wrote of the spiral wing, of the gliders he had once imagined hanging in the rafters of great cathedrals, of wings made not to escape Earth, but to understand it better. He wondered aloud on paper whether the human soul was born from air itself, whether it remembered flight from some distant origin, whether our restlessness, our search for meaning, was simply homesickness for the sky. He asked the wind to carry these thoughts one day, not now, but after he was gone, when his bones lay still and his sketches had faded. Perhaps then the letter would rise, finally unburdened by the hand that wrote it. There was no ending, Dot, no farewell, just a final line. If I have not flown, at least I have looked up. He placed the letter in a drawer no one would think to open, beneath old tools, dried pigments, and scraps of linen from unfinished works. He knew it would likely never be found, but that was never the point. The writing was the ascent, the thoughts, the wings. And that evening, as the candle melted into a soft pool of amber wax, Leonardo leaned back and closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in peace. He had spoken to the sky, not as an inventor, not as a genius, but as a boy who had once chased birds through the Tuscan wind and had never stopped trying to follow them. And though the wind did not answer that night, it did brush gently through the open window. A quiet reply, a silent nod, as if the sky had been reading all along. Asterisk, asterisk, it was late, later than usual. The fire in the hearth had grown timid, casting soft, trembling shadows on the curved walls of Leonardo's quiet study. The world outside was hushed, wrapped in mist, as if even the stars had pulled a blanket of clouds over their light. And Leonardo sat alone, his eyes closed, yet his hand moved, slowly, delicately, across a wide sheet of parchment stretched before him. His fingers guided the quill, not by sight, but by memory, by instinct. He was sketching wings, but not the rigid wings of machines or the structured gliders he had built in his youth. These were not governed by calculation or geometry. They emerged from feeling soft lines born of breath and rhythm. Not ruled. His hand glided over the page like a bird tracing a thermal current, rising and dipping with no hesitation, no need. To see Dot, it was as if the lines were already there, and his task was simply to reveal them. The candle beside him flickered gently, as if holding its breath. The entire room seemed to lean in, watching something sacred unfold. Leonardo's breathing was slow, almost imperceptible, each exhale timed with the sweep of the quill, each stroke a whisper of memory, of longing. These were not just sketches. They were meditations, moments etched in ink that felt older than his hands, older than time itself. He remembered, then, a hawk he had once watched as a child. It had soared over the hills of Vinci, circling a thermal draft, unmoving but entirely in motion. It had held the sky in its wings without ever flapping them. That was the feeling he now followed, not the shape of wings, but their stillness, their purpose, their trust in the invisible. Dot in his mind. He no longer saw parchment. He saw wind. Dot curved, Dot layered, Dot alive. Dot his hand moved through that wind, guiding lines through currents. No one else could see Dot, and in that movement he felt weightless, free from gravity, but unbothered by it. Dot, as if drawing itself became flight. Dot, no one had taught him this. No geometry book explained it. No commission demanded it. It was his alone, a ritual as private as prayer. He did not care if the sketch would be kept, or copied, or even finished. Its purpose was not permanence. Dot, it was presence, a moment of communion between the hand, the heart, and the hope that something beyond us, listens when we are still. He remembered other nights like this, nights when the world grew so quiet that even the rustle of his robe felt like thunder. He would sketch not for progress, but for peace. Lines not for solving problems, but for resting in them. The wings he drew this night were wide and uneven. One curved more deeply than the other. The feathers were too soft, too dreamlike, almost dissolving at the edges. It did not matter. Perfection was never the point. The beauty of the drawing came from the fact that it was blind, not careless, but trusting. A kind of surrender, with a mind let go and the soul took over. In the morning, someone would find the page and wonder what it meant. Perhaps they would try to understand it, to measure it, to turn it into something useful. But they would be missing the truth. This was not a design, It was a breath, a memory of a moment when a man, nearing the end of his life, remembered what it felt like to fly, not in body, but in spirit, to draw not what he saw, but what he felt rising inside him, to believe that in some quiet corner of the world, a wing is always waiting to unfold. Asterisk, asterisk, there are some moments in life that leave no evidence, no sketches, no witnesses, no notes scribbled in the margins of a leather-bound book, only silence. And Leonardo, for all his chronicling of the world, the muscles of horses, the flow of rivers, the curls of hair in a Florentine breeze, knew that not all truths were meant to be recorded one evening. Long before France and the quiet halls of Angouaz, before kings called upon his genius, before Rome with its ruined dreams, he had wandered beyond the village where he was born. He remembered it clearly, not the exact date, nor the reason, but the feeling. The path was narrow and stony, framed by tall grasses that bent like listeners to the hum of evening crickets. The sky was painted with the slow gradient of dusk, that moment when color seems unsure whether to stay or surrender. He had come there to think, but he stayed to listen, and what he heard was nothing, not the silence of absence, but the presence of something unspeakably whole, the kind of silence that hums behind all things, that waits patiently beneath noise, like a lake beneath ripples. And it happened. He looked up, and there outlined, against the last breath of daylight, was a shape. Not a bird, not a cloud, not a thing with feathers or function, but it moved, gracefully, effortlessly, with intention, but without effort. Leonardo did not blink. He didn't try to identify it. For perhaps the first time in his life, he did not reach for analysis, did not run through anatomy, physics, or structure. He simply watched. The figure hovered just for a moment, then curved upward, higher and higher, and disappeared into a shade of blue that had already become night. It was flight, pure flight, but not of machine or nature, not even of man, a vision, perhaps, a dream witnessed while awake. He never spoke of it, not to his apprentices, not to his patrons, not even in his notebooks, where he confessed everything else, but it remained, a private relic of wonder. It would return to him on quiet nights, like a soft echo between candle flickers and rustling paper. Sometimes it arrived in dreams, sometimes in the pause between strokes of the quill. That single memory, that unrecorded flight, became a compass of sorts, not toward achievement, but toward mystery. It reminded him that not all things are meant to be explained, that some truths exist simply to be felt. He would recall how his body stilled when he saw it, how his breathing slowed, how he forgot where he was. He did not feel envy. He did not feel fear. Only recognition. As if the part of him that had always longed for wings had, for one precious second, been seen. Perhaps the vision was real. Perhaps it was imagined. He never questioned it, because the truth lay not in its reality, but in its effect. From that day on, when Leonardo drew wings, he drew them softer. When he studied lift, he looked beyond structure. when he dreamed of rising from the earth. He no longer dreamed of escape. He dreamed of return. Return to that feeling, that silence, that knowing. And though he would go on to design flying machines, sketch birds mid-flight, and unravel the physics of air, he never again chased the thing he saw that day, because it was not a goal. It was a gift. Asterisk, a silent witness to the sky's deepest promise, that flight is not always a matter of height, but of surrender. And so, when others asked why he pursued the air, why he obsessed over the impossible, why he sketched wings over and over like prayers, written in ink, he never quite answered because the truth lived in that silent flight. Truth without words, without proof, but with presence. And that was enough. Asterisk, there is a peculiar silence in unfinished things. A kind of quiet that lingers, not because of failure, but because of choice. A page left half-filled, a note unsung, a door that was always meant to remain slightly ajar. And for Leonardo, who had filled volumes with diagrams, inventions, mirrored, thoughts and fragments of genius, there was one drawing he never completed. It was a design for flight, not a grand machine with pulleys and gears, not one of his elaborate ornithopters or helical screws. This one was different, smaller, simpler, more intimate. It had no name. No instructions. No measurements. Just a soft outline of a structure that looked less like an invention and more like a memory, a whisper of a possibility. He had begun it during one of his last winters, in the manner given to him by the King of France. The days were cold and short. The wind would sometimes howl across the river with a voice like a forgotten choir. He would sit by the fire, a heavy cloak around his shoulders, and draw in silence. The first lines came easily. They flowed like breath, as if his hand had waited years to release them. The frame of the wings appeared first delicate arcs, not unlike the branches of a willow in spring. Then the body, not shaped for speed, but for balance. It resembled no bird he had ever seen. No bat, no glider. Just something possible. But then he stopped. Not because he was tired, not because his hand trembled. He simply stopped, and he never returned to it. The page remained on his table, anchored under a smooth river stone, untouched by ink again. Visitors never noticed. Apprentices assumed it was just another draft, discarded or paused. But for Leonardo, it was something else entirely. It was enough. He had no desire to complete it, because the drawing wasn't about the craft, rather it was about the surrender. In that design, he had poured the final dream, not of soaring above cities, or achieving immortality in science, but of being carried gently upward, silently, without struggle. The kind of flight one feels in dreams, when the body is weightless, when gravity forgets to pull, and the air wraps around you like a friend. He had spent his life solving problems, dissecting beauty, decoding the divine order of things. But this design was not a solution. It was a goodbye, a gesture, a moment where he released his need to understand, to perfect, to conquer. He no longer needed wings to lift him. He had become the wing, and in that, there was peace. At night, as the fire dimmed and shadows stretched across the wooden beams of the ceiling, he would look at the unfinished sketch and smile. A faint smile, the kind only seen in those who know something others do not. He knew that. Leaving it unfinished gave it life. A finished design could be tested, judged, perhaps even failed. But this was safe in its incompletion. It could remain a mystery, eternal and untouched. Some say he meant to return to it, that time or health stole the chance. But those who knew him best, those who watched how still he sat before it, understood, had already finished it, not on paper. But within, because sometimes the most complete expression of a dream is to leave it in silence, to let it drift gently beyond the reach of ink and parchment. to trust that what was imagined once still floats somewhere, waiting, unseen, but never lost. Asterisk, asterisk, there are voices in nature that never shout. They do not demand attention, nor do they arrive with fanfare or urgency. They come like old friends, familiar, unhurried, full of secrets too. Fast to say, all at once, and for the young Leonardo, it was the wind that spoke first. Not books, not men of letters, not the geometry of domes or the anatomy of beasts, but the wind. It had been his first teacher. He remembered the Tuscan hills as they were then golden in summer, soft with mist in spring. Olive trees stood like silent guardians, and the vineyards rippled like green oceans under the sky. But it was the wind that gave movement to stillness. It turned fields into dancers. It carried the scent of fig trees and distant thunder, and it whispered things he could never quite put into words. He would climb to the top of the tallest hill he could reach, not to escape, but to listen. Sometimes it came as a breeze, gentle and playful, tugging at his curls like a child, trying to get his attention. Other times it came in gusts, firm and full of direction, pushing him forward as if urging him not to stay still for too long. He learned early that the wind had moods. It was not always kind, but it was always honest. When he was a boy of 7, lying on his back with arms outstretched on the hillside, he once imagined that if he breathed in deeply enough, the wind would lift him, that he would rise not by force, but by trust. And in those moments, he felt something stir, not just in the air, but inside his chest, a yearning, not for escape, but for becoming part of the world in motion. Later in life, when he would study air currents and draft designs for flying machines, he would remember those feelings not as fantasies, but as early encounters with truths too pure to be explained. He knew that real understanding did not always begin with logic. Sometimes it began with stillness, with wonder, with the quiet surrender of sitting alone, listening. The wind taught him how to observe not just what was visible, but what was felt. How a tree bent could reveal the direction of an unseen force. How a bird adjusted its wings, not by fighting the air, but by dancing with it. How sound could be carried farther when the air was cool, and how sense could warn of storms. Before clouds appeared, he began to write less and notice more. Not everything he learned from the wind could be written in his notebooks. Some things he kept within a catalog of feelings, of intuitions, of gentle knowings. And there were times, even as an old man in France, when a sudden breeze through an open window would stop his hand mid-sketch. He would close his eyes and listen, not with ears, but with memory. It would take him back to the hill, to the way the grass whispered against his legs, to the way the clouds seemed to lean in, curious and close. To the way the wind had once carried his name, not spoken aloud, but felt like a touch on the soul. He had never forgotten that. It reminded him always that the world was not only to be understood, but to be loved. That learning was not just an accumulation, but a returning. And that the wind unseen, untamed, was never just wind. It was movement. It was story. It was invitation. Even as others praised his genius, his inventions, his insights, Leonardo often felt like a boy again, barefoot on a sun-warmed hill, arms wide, listening to the breeze, because the wind had told him something long ago, that the answers he sought were not just in books or machines. They were in the quiet spaces between breaths. In the invisible currents that touched everything. In the way he felt when the air moved, and he allowed himself to move with it. And so he kept that promise. To always listen. To always wonder. To always let the wind finish what he could never begin alone. Asterisk, asterisk, to most, gravity was a burden. It pulled things down. It made men fall. It dragged apples from trees and dreams from the sky. It held back every attempt to rise. But to Leonardo, gravity was never the villain. It was a partner, a gentle keeper, a quiet, sacred law that reminded all things where they belonged. From his earliest sketches of flight, Leonardo studied gravity, not with resentment, but with reverence. He watched how a leaf did not fall straight down, but danced on its descent, its edges catching currents, its path unpredictable and beautiful. He noted how birds did not defy gravity, but harmonized with it, how they used its pull to dive, to glide, to return home. He knew that to fly was not to escape gravity, but to understand it so deeply that one could move with it, rather than against it. Dot in his notebooks, alongside designs of machines and theories of motion. He wrote quietly poetic thoughts, reflections on weight and lift, on the grace of descent, on the honesty of falling. He called gravity the soul's reminder that we are part of the earth. There was a time in his middle years when he observed a falcon circling above a vineyard. For nearly an hour, he did nothing else. He sat on a low stone wall and watched. The bird never flapped its wings. It simply turned again and again, caught in the balance between air and pull. A perfect meditation, a dance with gravity. He remembered whispering aloud to no one but the wind, "It trusts." That was the difference. The falcon did not resist gravity. It cooperated. It leaned into the fall when needed, curved with the current, and trusted that the invisible laws of the world would cradle it if it listened closely enough. This Leonardo believed was not only how birds flew, it was how people should live. Not in resistance to the forces around them, but in awareness of them. Not clinging to control, but responding with grace. When he imagined flight, he imagined it not as escape, but as surrender. The kind of surrender that does not mean defeat, but wisdom. In his quiet hours, often in the soft blue light before dawn, he would sit by his window, a cup of warm water in hand, and think about how gravity was not simply a physical truth. It was a metaphor, a grounding, a presence that said, "You are still part of the world." Many men he knew spent their lives trying to overcome this truth. They built towers, launched arrows, climbed peaks, always trying to go higher. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. But Leonardo saw the beauty in being held. Even in his most audacious designs for human flight, he accounted for return, for landing, for descent, for rest, because what rises must return. And he found that to be comforting. He once wrote that the joy of flight was not in escaping the ground, but in feeling it call you back softly, reminding you that you are not separate, but connected. In old age, when his legs no longer carried him far and his bones felt the weight of time, he found new respect for gravity. He did not curse the slowness of movement. Instead, he noticed how each step was a conversation with the earth, how leaning forward was a trust, how standing upright was, in itself, a quiet act of balance. He would chuckle gently, telling his apprentice that every step was like a wind beat, not dramatic, not rushed, just part of the rhythm. He wished, in those final years, to write a book, not on flight, but on falling, on the grace of returning, on how letting go was not loss, but peace. Though that book was never written, its spirit lived in his final days. In the way he smiled, when the breeze moved his curtain. In the way he traced the shape of a falling petal, with his eyes. In the way he leaned his head against the wall, not to rest, but to listen to the soft heartbeat of gravity. He knew that all things must come down, not as punishment, but as a lullaby. Not as failure, but as invitation. To pause, to exhale, to remember that even stars fall beautifully, gently, and in that falling, they light the sky. Asterisk, asterisk, it was a night wrapped in stillness, not the kind imposed by sleep, but the kind that invites it. The stars above the Chateau d'Amboise blinked softly. as if nodding to the thoughts of the old man who lay beneath them. The fireplace had long since faded to embers, and the hush of midnight settled across the room like a woolen blanket. It was then that Leonardo dreamed, but it was not a dream of gears and levers, nor of soaring machines. Arched toward heaven, it was a dream of feathers, billions of them, falling, floating, drifting through endless space. They came not from any bird he recognized, but from somewhere deeper, perhaps the soul of a forgotten aviary, or a memory never lived. Each feather glided with its own rhythm. Some curled downward in slow spirals, others darted sideways. Caught in unseen breezes, they moved like thoughts gentle, curious, never hurried. And Leonardo, in this dream, was not flying. He was among them, not as a man, not as an engineer, but as something light, something unbound. Perhaps not even himself any more, but a sensation, the soft touch of down brushing against time. There were no wings in this dream, only feathers, because wings, he had come to believe, were about ambition. They were constructed, shaped with effort, directed toward goals. Wings implied flight with destination, but feathers simply were. They did not seek. They responded. They did not conquer. They yielded, they did not carry the body. They carried the moment. And as he drifted in this soft ocean of air, Leonardo began to understand why he had always been drawn to the study of birds, not as inspiration for machines, but as teachers of surrender. He remembered a heron by the river Arno, its feathers catching the early light like silver thread. He had been young then, sketching furiously, desperate to trap its motion in ink. But he had missed the point. The beauty was never in the anatomy, It was in the way. The heron allowed itself to belong to the sky, not to dominate it, not to master it, just to belong, in his dream. Leonardo could feel the air thick with meaning, the kind of meaning that has no words, only presence. The feathers around him were not symbols. They were not metaphors, they were truths. Each one whispered something different. Some spoke of gentleness, others of letting go. One brushed past his cheek and said nothing at all, but in that silence, he felt peace. For the first time, perhaps ever, he was not designing, not analyzing, not imagining something greater than what was. He was simply being a presence among soft presences, a thought inside a sigh. When he awoke, he did not speak, not. Immediately, he lay still, the early dawn brushing the window with the faintest blush of rose. The dream had left no image he could draw, no invention to record, but it had left something else, a feeling that stayed, like a feather caught in the folds of his mind. He walked slowly to his desk and looked at his sketches, machines with beating wings, sails shaped like backbones, contraptions that mimicked the spine of birds, and he smiled, not because they were wrong, but because they were reaching too. Far, he took up a blank page, not to sketch a new design, but to write a single line. Flight is not what lifts us. He paused, then added another. It is what lets us fall gently. He did not sign it. He did not share it. But from that day on, his gaze toward the sky softened. He no longer sought to pierce it, only to meet it, as a feather meets the breeze, with no command, no resistance, just the quiet agreement of two things. Meant to touch, asterisk, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks are scattered across time like forgotten relics of thought. Pages filled with sketches, hypotheses, anatomical marvels, machines, maps, and mysterious devices. But beyond their brilliance and variety, one peculiar feature threads through nearly all of them. The writing goes backward, mirror writing, as it came to be known. He wrote from right to left, each letter reversed, as if meant to be read only with the aid of a mirror. Many speculated it was to guard his ideas, to veil his inventions from prying eyes. Others claimed it was a sign of secrecy, of codes, or of a mind so unique that even his handwriting bent to its own rules. But in truth, the reason was far quieter, far more human. It had little to do with secrecy and everything to do with solitude. Leonardo's world was always filled with observation, with watching, with noting the tiniest details others missed. The curve of a flower petal, the way shadows gathered at the corners of a smile, the precise motion of a dragonfly's wings. But the backward script was not an invention of intellect. It was a comfort, not an act of quiet intimacy with himself. Writing that way felt more natural to his hand, yes, but it also turned the page into a mirror of his thoughts. It made the act of journaling feel like whispering secrets not to the world, but to his own reflection. When the world outside grew loud, when politics threatened, when friends grew distant, or when faith failed to explain the mysteries he uncovered, with every dissection, Leonardo returned to his pages, and he wrote backward, not to hide from the world, but to face himself more clearly. Each page became a conversation, not between genius and future generations, but between the man and his inner voice, between the scientist and the child who still dreamed of feathers. There is a kind of peace in that. To write not for an audience, but for understanding. To speak in a way only your own eyes can decode. Some entries were complex, measurements of bridges, descriptions of machines that could walk or fly or glide through water. Others were soft, lists of people he had seen that day, notes on the way like touched an old woman's cheek, ideas for a painting he knew he'd never finish. And then there were the secrets, the real ones, not inventions, not diagrams, but emotions. Sorrow for a friend, lost too early. Joy in the shape of a cloud, loneliness he could never admit aloud. On one page, he wrote a phrase only he could decipher. I have grown old and still do not know the color of the wind. It is a sentence that no scientist would need, no inventor would draw upon. Yet it said more than 1,000 designs ever could. That was the essence of his mirror-writing. Not just to reverse the direction of language, but to reverse the gaze. To look inward, to hold the fleeting thoughts that would be too delicate, too easily misunderstood if offered forward. And as he aged, he wrote more and more in this reversed script. It did not slow him down. It focused him. Each backward word was a step toward himself, a retreat not into isolation, but into reflection. Some nights he would write by candlelight, the letters casting shadows that only he understood. The quill would scratch softly across the parchment like footsteps in fresh snow. Outside, the wind might carry distant voices or the rustling of leaves, but inside there was only the dialogue of pen and thought. Sometimes he imagined that when he died, someone would read his pages and understand not just what he had made, but who he had been. Not the master, not the legend, but the boy who once asked the wind to lift him. And if they read the pages in a mirror, slowly, patiently, they might find not just designs for gliders and pumps and theatrical props, but a heart, quiet, curious, unfinished, like all true hearts are. In the end, Leonardo did not hide his secrets with mirror writing. He revealed them, but only to those willing to slow down, turn the page around, and read with the same kind of wonder he felt when he first watched a bird take flight. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. There are portraits the world knows by name. Mona Lisa, Lady with an Ermine, Ginevra da Vinci, faces caught forever in oil, suspended between centuries, their eyes quietly meeting ours with unspoken intimacy. But among Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, buried deep in pages rarely seen, there is a drawing of a woman he never titled, and she never spoke. She is not seated in grandeur, nor draped in the expected elegance of nobility. Her clothing is simple, perhaps even modest. No jewelry, marks her as a patron or muse. There is no background to declare her status or scene. Just her, softly lit by Leonardo's hand, caught in the act of turning, not toward the artist, but away. It is a gesture that feels accidental. But knowing Leonardo, it was anything but. The drawing was not made with preparation or plan. There are no preliminary studies, no rehearsed versions, no signed attribution. It was done in haste, and yet with incredible gentleness. Every line has weight. Every shadow suggests a long gaze. Before the pencil ever touched parchment, he drew her once, only once, and he never added a name. To some, she is just another anonymous study in a collection overflowing with anatomy, machinery, and musings. But to those who read him carefully, those who followed the rhythm of his mirror-written thoughts and the sorrow tucked behind his inventions, she was different. She was not part of a commission, not part of a study. She was memory. She was silence. Remembered. And when he drew her, he was no longer Leonardo the master. He was simply Leonardo, the man. Perhaps he met her long before France, in the streets of Florence, or in the shaded corners of Milan's courts. Perhaps she sold fruit by the river, or sang quietly in church pews no one noticed. Perhaps she was real. Perhaps she was imagined. But what matters is this: she stayed with him. Not in name, not in story, but in presence. In the way her shoulder tilted away from the viewer, as if she was being called back into a room behind the drawing, in the softness of her jaw, suggesting kindness, and the faint curve of her mouth, not quite a smile, more like something remembered, rather than expressed. He didn't color her in. He didn't render her an oil or panel. He didn't draft an architectural setting or hint at narrative. Because he didn't want to define her. He wanted to keep her. Untouched. Unclaimed by galleries or scholars or time. She was the only one he never labeled. Not even a date, not even a word in the margins. And that is how he wanted her to remain. Some say she was a ghost from his youth, a fleeting affection, a sister of a friend, a dancer he once saw and never forgot. But to Leonardo, she became more than any of that. She became a tether, a reminder that not everything needed to be solved, not everything needed explanation. In a life obsessed with understanding, the veins of the body, the flight of birds, the weight of water. She was the one thing he allowed to remain unknown. He kept the drawing tucked in the back of one of his older folios, not hidden, just quiet. Occasionally, he would bring it out in the evenings, not to revise or study, but simply to see her again. He would hold the page between his hands, his fingers never quite touching the corners. And in those moments, something about his breath would soften, as if the act of looking at her restored a part of him he couldn't quite name. Either. Not joy, grief, something deeper, recognition perhaps, a part of his soul sketched not in invention or pursuit, but in stillness. And then gently, he would return the page to its place, unfinished, unspoken, unlabeled, and he would continue on, drawing wings, designing fortresses, dissecting the human form, all while carrying within him the presence of a woman whose name the world will never know. And perhaps that was the point, that some beauty is meant to be carried, not shared, that some truths are drawn, not spoken, that some memories are not meant to be understood, but simply remembered. Asterisk, in the final pages of a leather-bound notebook one never catalogued, one never signed, there are marks of ash, faint black edges, curling like whispers, and a soft, smoky residue clinging to the parchment. No diagrams remain there, no notes, no formulas, only silence scorched into the fiber of the page, because once Leonardo da Vinci drew something he later chose to erase, not with ink, not with correction, but with fire. He called it the Angelo, Makiniko, the mechanical angel. We do not know what it looked like. Not exactly. What little is known survives only through echoes. A brief mention in a letter from a curious apprentice. A vague allusion in a list of divine impossibilities. He drafted one evening while ill, and a half-melted brass gear found in a drawer never meant to be opened. But those who stood close to him in those last years, those who watched the growing stillness in his eyes, the way he would pause mid-sentence and look skyward, knew the story in pieces. It began as a dream, not unlike many of his inventions. A vision in twilight, a shape glimpsed while half asleep, that he tried to bring into the waking world with lines and levers. But this one was different. It was not meant to fly like a bird or glide like a bat. It was not modeled after anything of nature. It was modeled after faith, after myth, after something he had once seen carved into a cathedral wall when he was still a boy, an angel descending, arms open, eyes closed, wings wide and unreal. That image had never left him. And in his last years, he tried to give it life. The plans were unlike any he had drawn before. Not mechanical in the usual sense. Not precise. Not even possible, some would argue. The wings were meant to unfold with silence. The chest was to emit music notes, struck not by strings, but by air passed through a chamber he called the respiro. The face was blank, not featureless, but open to interpretation. Designed, he said, to reflect only the heart of the one who looks upon it. It was not a machine. It was a mirror. And as he built, in secret, with wood, wire, silk, and hope, something inside him began to change. At first, he was consumed with it, working long into the night, forgetting to eat, forgetting the names of those who called his name from the door. The angel took form quickly. Wings moved. Music hummed softly. The body stood. And then it wept. Or so the story goes. The apprentices, frightened by a strange sound in the workshop, claimed they saw it drops of moisture from the hollow eyes. Leonardo never confirmed it, never denied it. He only said, some things are not meant to be finished. What he had created, he realized, was not just a mechanism. It was a prayer, but it had no soul, and that broke him in a way no failure ever had. He had dissected bodies, drawn hearts and wombs, modeled the motions of stars, but in this creation, he had tried to summon something divine, and he had failed, because the divine cannot be summoned. It can only be glimpsed, touched briefly in art, in love, in silence, but never controlled, never caged in wire and brass. So one night, as the fire crackled gently in the hearth, he carried the plans to the flame, not with rage, not with sorrow, with peace. He fed them, one by one, into the fire, watching the lines curl, the parchment darken, the ink vanish into light. The angel stood nearby, its face still turned toward nothing, wings closed like a book long unread. He did not burn the machine, only the idea, only the desire to hold, as sacred in his hands. And when it was done, he sat quietly for a long time, the warm glow of the fire dancing against the walls, the ashes whispering upward into the chimney, into the night. He kept the angel hidden. He never spoke of it again. But sometimes, on clear evenings, he would walk, alone in the garden, look toward the stars, and smile, not at what he had made, but at what he had let go, because letting go, he had come to learn, is the final act of a true creator. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. There are drawers we never open, boxes left untouched, corners of a life quietly folded away. In the grand house where Leonardo spent his last years, a stone manor, nestled among gardens and soft hills and amboise, there existed such a place. A drawer, small and shallow, tucked beneath the corner of his writing desk. Not locked, not hidden. Just forgotten. Or perhaps deliberately ignored. because within that drawer, they say, lay a piece of parchment, unmarked on its back, yellowed by time, yet crisp, and on it, drawn in the softest graphite strokes, was a figure few would have recognized. That it was not a machine, not a face, not a map or a wing or a mechanical miracle. That it was a path, a winding, narrow path, drawn as if from the air, starting nowhere. In particular, and ending in a light fog of smudged lines. Around it, vague shapes suggested trees, perhaps ruins, perhaps arches. No labels, no notes. Only a single line written faintly beneath it in mirrored Latin. Quod sequitur non invenitur nisi corde. What follows is not found, except by the heart. The apprentices never found it. Historians never mentioned it. It was not catalogued among his known works, not referenced in his journals. And yet, according to one servant, an old man who had once dusted the desk each morning, Leonardo would often open the drawer, look at the sketch for a long moment, and close it again. No words, just a long, thoughtful silence, as if remembering. Something he had never spoken aloud. Many believed this sketch never existed, but those who truly understood him, those who had read the margins of his notebooks, who had studied the contradictions in his art and the long pauses in his stories, suspected otherwise. Because by then, Leonardo was no longer drawing the world outside. He was sketching the world within. This path simple, curved, incomplete was not a plan for invention or architecture. It was a meditation, a reflection, perhaps even a farewell. It was not meant for anyone else. It was not meant to be found. It was meant to exist, silently, like a breath held in memory, like a trail walked only in dreams. What might it have represented? Some say it was the trail he walked as a boy, from his home in Vinci to the woods beyond, where he first glimpsed the wings of birds in slow motion and imagined what it might be like to follow them. Others believe it was a symbol of his mind always circling, always returning, never resting long in one place. A few imagine it was a final design, not of a machine or a body or a system, but of the soul's journey after death. A path that cannot be engineered, only intuited. A direction without a destination. But the truth remains veiled. The sketch was never found when he passed. Perhaps it was burned, perhaps misplaced, or perhaps he took it with him in his memory, folded not in cloth, but in thought carried gently into whatever dream awaited him. Beyond sleep, we are left only with the idea of it. And perhaps that is enough. Because sometimes the most powerful creations are not those seen, but those imagined. Not those hung in galleries or printed in books, but those whispered between one breath and the next. A path, unseen. Drawn not for others, but for oneself. Final sketch, not to guide the world, but to guide the self. And in that soft, unfinished line, it curved toward nothing and everything. Leonardo da Vinci may have left his most honest truth, that even the greatest mind finds peace not in answers, but in wonder. The morning that Leonardo closed his eyes for the last time was not marked by thunder, nor wind, nor any celestial fanfare. No comet passed, no earthquake split the earth. In fact, the world was quiet, gently wrapped in birdsong and the faint rustling of leaves outside his window. A calm morning, the kind he always preferred. He was not alone, but it was not the crowd of admirers, students, or patrons that surrounded him. Those had faded in the days prior. Instead, only the soft presence of his most faithful assistant remained, a young man who had grown up beside his thoughts, his habits, his silences. He sat nearby, reading quietly, watching the rhythm of Leonardo's breath, as one might watch a tide each exhaled gentler than the last. And when that final breath came, it was not with struggle or protest. It was like a feather falling. No sound. Just release. Somewhere in his dreams, Leonardo was not dying. He was simply continuing walking a path without a name, beneath skies without clocks, guided not by purpose, but by wonder that no funeral bells tolled that day. At least not immediately. The world took its time to acknowledge his departure, as if not quite ready to let go. But in the hours that followed, the light in his room changed. It grew warmer, as though nature, having waited patiently, had now stepped forward to claim him, not with force, but with welcome. The oak desk where he once drew sat untouched, but not empty. The pages on it remained still, but not silent. The air around his books, his notes, his brushes and jars, all of it seemed to hold something new. Not the presence of loss, but the echo of continuation. Because Leonardo da Vinci had never belonged fully to this world. Not in the way most people do. He had lived in between earth and idea, between flesh and flight. And now, at last, he had crossed that invisible threshold. He had always tiptoed along. To many, death is a closing. But for Leonardo, it was the opening he had long anticipated. A return to the dream, the one without machines, the one without titles, the one made of feathers, not wings. If anyone had stood by his side in that final moment and placed a hand upon his heart, they might have noticed something peculiar, a softness, not the weakness of age, but the ease of surrender, a kind of arrival. He had, in his final hours, become the thing he chased his whole life, not a bird, not a machine, not even an idea, but an acceptance. An understanding that flight was never about reaching somewhere higher. It was about releasing the weight, letting go of the urgency. And allowing oneself to be held by the air. In the weeks after, as his belongings were sorted. Some wondered what his last invention had been. Some searched his notes for secrets. Others speculated about unfinished works or messages hidden in the folds of his mirrored writing. But none of them found the dream, because the dream could not be written. It could only be lived, and perhaps it still drifts among us in the pause, between thoughts, in the sigh before sleep, in the way our minds sometimes wander when we stare out a window and forget what we were looking for. That is where the dream landed, not in a museum, not in a monument, but in the quiet places. Where wonder lives without audience. Where flight is felt, not achieved, where the soul, featherlight, lets go. And floats. Asterisk, asterisk,